Today we're talking about why we're going extinct. By we, I mean not just Europe, but the entire planet, or at least most regions and countries. You might want to ask right now, are we really going extinct? In general, yes, we are. Now I'll show a few colourful charts with numbers that make quite a strong impression if you've never seen them before. If you have, the effect will be pretty much the same. All the statistics are no later than 2024. It doesn't get more up to date than that. In front of you is the fertility rate in Europe in the middle of the last century. In 1950, there were almost 3 children per woman in this region. By 2025, that figure had effectively halved. Now there are just over 1 child per woman. Why is this a problem? Because to maintain the size of a given population, the fertility rate must not fall below 2.1. I emphasize that in this case we're talking only about maintaining the population, not increasing it. That is, if there are slightly more than 2 children per woman, then in the next generation there will be about as many people as in the previous one. For the population to grow, the rate has to be significantly higher. If the fertility rate falls below this value, then the next generation will be smaller than the previous one. And that is exactly the extinction we are dealing with. But let's look at Asia. There are a lot of Asians, so things there are probably not so bad. In fact, things are much worse. The numbers are in front of you. An absolutely shocking 0.8 in South Korea. China and Japan are right behind, and here are South and North America. All the most important and largest countries, Canada, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and of course, the United States, are clearly in this trend. This is Asia again, but now as a whole. As you can see, there are green zones, but they are, so to speak, quite specific. And finally, Africa, the last hope of humanity. We'll talk about the specific countries, the last hope, and some other non-obvious and interesting points later. Here, it was important for me to show that the extinction of 2/3 of the countries on our planet is not a myth or the ramblings of a madman, but a reality. It is happening right now as you watch this video. But why? Why have people suddenly stopped having children? And judging by these colourful charts with numbers, it seems that the more prosperous a country is, the lower its fertility rate. Of course, there are exceptions, but in general this is the case. Today we'll go over all the main reasons. Subscribe everywhere, and let's begin. Having some familiarity with this topic, at first I wanted to make a list and arrange the reasons from less to more important. It would have looked something like this. In 9th place, for example, contraception. In 3rd, urbanization. And in 1st place, the main cause with the greatest impact. However, in the course of the research, it turned out that things are a bit more complicated. The same reasons are cited in the literature on this topic, which is perfectly normal, but there is no consensus about the main one. As always, there are different viewpoints that seem equally convincing. Therefore, the most accurate approach, in my view, is the following ranking. We will divide all the reasons into 2 groups, structural and modifying. Structural reasons are factors that determine how many children people consider rational. That is, they shape the long-term demand for children. They answer the question of why modern societies tend toward low fertility in principle, and are weakly reversible or not reversible at all. Modifying reasons are factors that affect how that demand is realized over time and in volume. These factors are short or medium term. They strongly depend on context, policy and culture, and they are reversible. That is, they can be influenced by changing that very context, policy or culture. They explain why, under similar structural conditions, different countries still differ in the age at first birth, the share of childlessness, the depth of the drop below 2.1, and other parameters. We begin with the structural reasons which, for convenience, we will arrange in chronological order. This way, everything will be clear and straightforward. Declining child mortality. This is an absolutely fundamental demographic factor, since it directly determines the number of births needed to achieve a given number of children surviving to adulthood. If, statistically, 30 to 50% of those born do not survive to adulthood, then in order to raise 3 children who will themselves grow up and reproduce, you need to have roughly 5 to 6. This is exactly the situation we had throughout our entire history up to the industrial era. For several thousand years, people had many children because high child mortality required high fertility. The turning point began only in the 19th century, continuing into the 20th. This is connected with the emergence of vaccines, antibiotics, the reduction of infectious diseases, overall improvements in nutrition, water supply, and of course, hygiene. I would very much like to remind you, and at one time this fact simply amazed me, that people began washing their hands before surgical operations in the mid-19th century. And we know exactly whom we owe this practice to. In 1847, Dr. Semmelweis, for the first time in human history, ordered his staff to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime before assisting with childbirth, including scrubbing the areas under their nails with a brush, and to do the same with instruments. Before that, such a practice simply did not exist. So today, thanks to advances in medicine and a much better understanding of how our bodies work, child mortality is at an extremely low level. One could say that we defeated it long ago. Today, almost everyone survives, so if you expect to see one adult of your own making, you only need to have one child. No backup is required. The next reason is urbanization, which changes the economics of the family. In pre-industrial societies, most of the population was employed in agriculture and lived in rural areas. Under such conditions, children are deeply integrated into the household economy and join it very early. This happens in stages. Simple tasks like helping around the house or looking after younger siblings begin as early as age 5. From around 8, regular physical help, bringing water or firewood, feeding animals and so on. From 10 to 12, more demanding tasks such as participating in field work. By age 14, almost full employment, like an adult. In other words, from an early age, children do something useful and make a contribution within their capacity. The situation begins to change radically in the same 19th century. Cities expand, a process that will only intensify, and people move out of the countryside. Urban environments are characterized by high housing costs, limited space, both parents working, and the weakness of the extended family. The child no longer does anything useful and makes no contribution. They are simply 100% dependent on their parents, which brings us to the next point. The cost of a child. As we have just seen, in the pre-industrial and pre-urban era, children partly paid for themselves through their early involvement in work. In the city, they turn into a pure expense, and the closer we get to the present, the larger this expense becomes. A peasant child in the 9th century does not need paid education, extracurricular activities or medical care, because these do not yet exist. This child does not need a computer, clothes and a phone like their peers. They do not need pocket money. This child is very cheap. Care essentially comes down to food and a small amount of attention. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, virtually everything in this regard changes. Now a child requires paid education, extracurriculars, and medical care. They need a computer, clothes, and a phone like their peers. They need pocket money. There is no way around it. Add to this the general rise in consumption standards and rampant inflation, which makes housing less and less affordable. According to a 2026 study, in the UK raising one child to the age of 18 costs about £220,000. Divide 220,000 by 18 years and you get 12,000. Divide 12,000 by 12 months and you get that, on average, a child costs £1,000 per month. This includes everything that constitutes a modern decent life with corresponding consumption, a room of their own, education, health, leisure, food, and so on. But this is only up to age 18. As far as I know, modern children very rarely become fully self-sufficient at that age. As a rule, support is needed much longer. Accordingly, the actual costs are even higher. More and more adults understand this, which is why children are not being born. Where this understanding suddenly came from, we turn to that right now. At the same time, in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially after World War II, a radical transformation takes place in the sphere of women's education and employment. Throughout history, married women could not own, inherit, or independently dispose of property. Traditionally, a woman herself was regarded as the property of a man. Women were forbidden from obtaining higher education, and were often denied even basic literacy, because a woman is meant for the home and children. Besides, education can corrupt her and lead her God knows where. Women were also excluded from most professions on the grounds of the supposed weakness of female nature. Over the period mentioned above, everything changed. A modern woman, having inhaled the fumes of feminism, emancipation, and independence, chooses between family and career. The higher her level of education and awareness, the more often she chooses a career. Of course, a woman may live with a man, but the key point here is the child. Today, women are increasingly less inclined to give birth because motherhood takes time, strength, and energy that could be spent on improving qualifications, building a business, or advancing up the career ladder. Men, like gas, tend to evaporate. In that case, there is the prospect of being left alone, with insufficient competence and experience for the current labour market, and with a child whose full support takes $125,000 a month. This looks quite bleak, so few are willing to take the risk. Another structural reason is individualism. Its emergence and consolidation take place in the same period. With the breakdown of traditional societies and modernization, the individual gains more and more rights, freedoms and money, and therefore more choice in life strategies. The individual becomes more autonomous. Entering into marriage and having children ceases to be seen as something obligatory. Now it is one option among many, and far from the most attractive one. We have already mentioned the reasons for this lack of attractiveness above. These are the same time, energy, and money that can be spent on climbing higher at work or creating a business altogether. In most cases, one really has to choose, either one or the other. That is either professional, creative, and material success, or children. Fewer and fewer people dream of having a child, and more dream of understanding political ideologies and regimes. If you are one of them, that opportunity has finally appeared. You can figure it out in my course, Understanding Politics. There we will, with maximum rigor and impartiality, analyse all the main political ideologies and regimes, see what they actually offer, and compare them with each other. We will also obséquently discuss the key concepts of political theory that directly relate to our lives, such as the state, censorship, propaganda, and so on. If you share these interests and values, sign up and we'll get to work. And now, to the modifying reasons. Secularization and the weakening of tradition. The transition to modern society takes place through a decline in the importance of traditional views and religion in social life. Naturally, this also affects reproduction. The point is that tradition and the religion directly associated with it call for people to be fruitful and multiply. This applies not only to the Abrahamic religions familiar to us, but to many others as well. One could say this is almost always the case. As tradition and religion become less significant, this call no longer sounds as insistent or as important. A man without a woman without a man, and cohabitation without children are no longer seen as something strange or deserving of condemnation. We now live not as our ancestors did, and not as prescribed in dubious ancient books, but as we ourselves have decided. And we are deciding not in favour of large families. In the second half of the 20th century, the sexual revolution takes place, along with the emergence of contraception in the modern sense of the word. These two processes unfolded in parallel and in many ways reinforced each other. The essence of the sexual revolution was that sex became separated from reproduction, gradually turning into something entirely ordinary. Whereas before this topic was taboo, or at least uncomfortable, now sex is simply another way to spend time. Explicit scenes and themes appear in the media, cinema, literature, music, and so on. Female sexuality is recognized as equal to male sexuality in terms of initiative and pleasure. Premarital and extramarital relationships are legitimized, and of course, diverse forms of sexuality are recognized. Before that, it was believed that there was one norm, heterosexuality, and everything else was deviation. Of all this, the key point for our topic is the separation of sex from reproduction, and its understanding primarily in terms of pleasure, for both partners, not just the man. Modern people have sex for the sake of sex itself, not for the continuation of the species. Contraceptives only reinforce this trend, since now one can have sex frequently and with anyone, while the risk of pregnancy is minimal. With temptations like that, who is going to have children? Because of urbanization, the spread of individualism and education, modern people enter into marriage later than before, which in turn reduces the likelihood of having children. It all comes down to female biology. First, statistically, The older a woman is, the lower the probability that she will conceive. Second, the older she is, the higher the probability that a child will have one or another health issue. Peak fertility falls roughly between the ages of 20 and 30. If the first child is postponed to a later time, this reduces the total number of potential pregnancies, even if both partners want children. To this we add the fact that our time is the time of single people. There will be a separate episode on this very soon. Earlier I spoke about energetic sex. In general, it is no longer in trend, or at least is falling out of it. More and more often, one can see reports that the number of single people, and, accordingly, single-person households is growing. This is the top 10 European countries by this parameter. This is the rule, not the exception, since the picture is similar in other countries as well. Just like in the good old days, let's return to the colourful charts we saw at the beginning. In front of us again are all of Asia and Africa. One cannot help but ask, why are these regions so green? Why do they have such high birth rates, just like in the good old days? That last exclamation is key. In these countries, people really do have children like in the good old days, because they live like in the good old days. We said that the structural causes of low fertility are the decline in child mortality due to improvements in medicine and overall living conditions, urbanization, the cost of a child, women's education and employment, and individualism. The modifying causes are secularization and the weakening of tradition, the sexual revolution and contraception, and late marriages and single-person households. Looking closely at these countries, we understand that, broadly speaking, this does not apply to them. And this is not just words. Almost all countries where the fertility rate significantly exceeds 2.1 are at the bottom of the rankings in terms of healthcare, urbanization, and education. These countries are predominantly underdeveloped, religious, and traditional. The only major exception is Israel. Now let's look again at the collective West, China, Japan, and Korea. Everything works again. These countries are at the top of the rankings in terms of healthcare, urbanization, and education. They are predominantly developed, secular, and individualistic. Some deviations and exceptions, of course, can always be found, but in general this is the pattern. It turns out that the ones who have many children are the poor and uneducated, who understand nothing, while those who have few are the rich and educated who can afford it. The more one looks at the statistics in these colourful charts, the more the tongue itself starts to say these words. Conclusions. The structural and modifying causes we have listed exist objectively. This is not a conspiracy or someone's ill will. Our civilization has developed and arrived at this point. We cannot undo medicine, urbanization, or the spread of education. To some extent, we can slow them down locally, but we cannot stop them completely. And why would we? Are there people who want education to become less accessible and medicine to become worse? Probably yes, but for the most part they live in the green countries, which are not particularly popular. Meanwhile, the popularity of the red countries is enormous. For the structural and modifying reasons named above, people in most countries of the world are shifting from quantity to quality. That is, they choose to have at most one child, into whom they will invest all their resources. More is not necessary and not affordable, and this is humanities. Subscribe everywhere. Come for English, coaching, and the course, Understanding Politics. See you.